from Jerusalem, like Iran. I don't go as far back as he does, but I'm still proud to be from Jerusalem. And I also grew up in a very standard Zionist family, nothing really out of the ordinary. But for me, the main thing that it meant, growing up under the Zionist narrative, was one very clear understanding, which is that Jews have only one way to survive, segregated from everyone else. After so many years of persecution and a fairly recent genocide in Europe, it's clear we can't trust anyone else, so we need to have our own state, a very strong military, and build high walls around ourselves and sit tight. So this is how I grew up. And I remember one of the first moments where this conception of reality started to crack a little bit for me. I was in my senior year of high school, and I found myself, by chance, really, in a village called Nealin. Nealin is a village close to the village Wind and Eran spoke about before, also suffering from the same condition, wherein the separation barrier is cutting through the village, annexing much of the land of the village, including olive groves that many of the people in this village have worked for generations, into Israel. And so, like many other villages, every Friday they have a protest. So I'm at the protest, and the rubber bullets, and the tear gas, and everything Iran is describing, and amidst all the chaos, I suddenly had my first moment of clarity. I look around at the walls and I realize we're not building high walls around ourselves. We're building high walls around other people, closing other people in. And I say it's a moment of clarity, but in some ways it's really a moment of confusion, because I felt so utterly disoriented. What I was seeing before my very eyes was in direct contradiction to everything that I knew to be true until that moment, everything that I had absorbed from my entire surroundings. So I was very, very confused. And so I realized I had to make sense of it. So I decided to go back to the West Bank. And for the period of the next several months, I joined Anarchists Against the Wall, and I became active with Palestinians. I went into Palestinian villages for the first time, spoke to Palestinians for the first time. And mind you, Jerusalem is 40% Palestinian, and I grew up in Jerusalem, and I never spoke to a Palestinian until then. And I met Palestinians for the first time, heard their stories, saw with my very eyes what the IDF was doing. And then several months in, my own draft date was approaching. And by that time, I knew, I had made sense of it. The IDF is not a defense force, so that's what we like to call it. The IDF is an occupying force. And as long as it was an occupying force, I was not going to participate. And luckily, I wasn't the only one. I got together with 9 peers from around the country, and together we decided to form the third resistance movement to the draft of high school seniors in Israel's history. And our premise was really very simple. We said the occupation relies upon soldiers to do the manning of the checkpoints and all the rest. No soldiers show up, therefore, no occupation. Simple as that. In fact, we were astonished that no one had ever thought about this brilliant plan before. So with that in mind, we got together, and the first thing we did was we wrote a letter. We wrote a petition. And we called ourselves the Shministim letter. Shministim is Hebrew for 12th graders. And we called ourselves the Shministim letter, and this is a paragraph that I translated for you from our petition that we wrote. But the gist of it is really that we're high school seniors resisting the draft because of the occupation. And so we went outside, we started mobilizing, we started going outside high schools and tried to recruit other high school seniors to our movement. About 4 months in, we look around the room, we realize we're still 10 people. And so it was a sobering moment, but we realized 10 people, we would not be able to take down the IDF. Ambitious though we were. So we said, all right, plan B. Plan B was to make as much noise as possible and to try to create a platform for ourselves from which to speak as high school seniors, because otherwise who would listen to a bunch of 18-year-olds in Israel? So we decided in a public act of refusal, we were going to go to the induction base, show up, and publicly resist service and endure the consequences, which we knew would be jail. So I remember the first date, the date of my draft very well. It was 7:30 a.m. I was marching up to the induction base. It was myself and some people from the Shministim and some people from Anarchists Against the Wall. And we were marching up with banners and signs, and around us were all the other parents and children kind of walking themselves to the gate to be drafted that day. And I'm walking up to the induction base gate, and I feel two things really strongly. On the one hand, I feel a deep sense of conviction. I could not have been more certain that this was the only right choice, the only moral choice that there was to do. But at the same time, I felt the deepest sense of shame I think I ever experienced. I felt like I was turning my back on my grandparents, who were Holocaust survivors, and left everything to come and establish this state for me. My father, who had served till the age of 45, my entire community. I was basically a traitor to my people. Of course, it didn't help that everyone around us was yelling at us that we were traitors to our people. It exacerbated the feeling, but I had it even before. And nonetheless, I knew I had to go through with it. So I went in and I refused the first order that I got, which was to become a soldier. That afternoon, I underwent what would be one of a series of 5 trials in the military court system, and that evening, I already found myself in Women's Military Prison 400. This is a facility I spent 4 months in, being shuttled back and forth between this facility and a detention facility in Tel Aviv. until I was finally exempted 4 months later and released from prison and exempted from service. And I like to share, usually, just one sort of story or really anecdote from prison, primarily because my time in prison was incredibly formative for me in terms of my worldview, and it also really shapes a lot of the activism that I'm engaged in today. So, a week into prison, I look around and I'm realizing something very interesting. I am the only Ashkenazi Jew in prison. So for those of you less familiar with the internal ethnic composition of Israeli Jews, Ashkenazi Jews are Jews from European descent. So I'm an Ashkenazi Jew on the one side of my family, I'm from Switzerland, on the other side I'm from Eastern Europe, so I'm a Jew of European descent, I'm Ashkenazi. We're actually only 40% of Israeli Jews, so actually the majority of Jews in Israel are actually not white. Where are the other Jews from? I'm glad you asked, a whole host of countries. We have a sizable Ethiopian migrant community over the last 2.5 decades. We have after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 90s, we had a massive immigration from the ex-Soviet bloc of Jews from there. Over 1 million Jews from there came. But the majority of Jews in Israel are actually what are known as Arab Jews or Mizrahi Jews, Jews of Middle Eastern and North African descent, like Eran's family from his father's side. So here I am in prison, and a weekend I'm looking around and I'm realizing I'm the only Jew from European background in the entire facility. So hopefully as Americans, this is coming as no surprise to you. Your prisons are also filled with people of color, and I hope I don't need to tell you that. But at the time, I was less aware, and I was really sort of concerned. Like, what does this mean? Why is this so? So I started to ask my fellow inmates. We had a lot of time to kill, as you can imagine. We were locked away in these rooms, and it was kind of boring for most of the time. And so I started to ask my fellow inmates, to hear their stories. And a little tip from me to you, if you're ever in prison, what are you in for is the ultimate conversation starter. Works every time. So I asked my fellow inmates, what are you in for? Why are you here? And I was really struck by their answer. The vast majority of women with me in prison were there because they had begun their military service and at some point had abandoned their post. They had gone AWOL. So I asked them, well, why did you go AWOL? So the fact that most Israeli Jews and some non-Jewish minorities also are drafted to the military in Israel, and that's mandatory, that's well known. What's less discussed, I find, is what kind of compensation young Israelis get for 2 or 4 years of their labor. The answer is not much. Across the board in Israel, the average Israeli soldier, particularly women who are relegated to sort of clerical work that's very much undervalued, but really across the board, Israeli soldiers get 1/10 of the Israeli minimum wage. That's $60 a month. These were all working class women, women of color, women of immigrant backgrounds. $60 a month was not going to cut it for them and their families who relied upon them as income providers. So they were literally punished for being poor. So I tell you this story primarily because this was my sort of second big moment of clarity if I think back on my political development. My whole life I was raised under the Zionist narrative. The Zionist narrative taught me that the state of Israel was a safe haven for all Jews, right? That's the idea. No matter where you're from, if you're Jewish, you can come to Israel and feel secure. Here I was in prison realizing that's a total fallacy. The state of Israel only promised that sense of security to Jews who looked like me, to Jews who were from Europe. But we were actually the minority. And Jews of color did not feel secure in Israel either. And so I realized I was in prison in many ways for the wrong reasons. I was in prison because I was against the occupation, very narrowly construed at the time, as the military occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. But in prison I realized the problem was much deeper and much more foundational. The problem was Zionism. And Zionism was a European movement for European Jews, by European Jews, and the state of Israel was really a state for European Jews and not for anyone else. So I left prison and I was determined to address this issue, not only to address the Palestinian question, but also to address the bad effects that the military and living in such a militarized state was having on Israeli Jews as well. Not just Palestinians were suffering from this. So I joined New Profile. New Profile is the Israeli feminist movement for the demilitarization of Israeli society. And one of the main things that we have done is we are a group primarily of Israeli women, and we've set up alternative education centers throughout the country where we try to expose young Israeli adults to different ideas, different narratives, that they would otherwise never hear under the rubric of state education. The kind of we try to provide the education that I wish that I had been exposed to when I was still in high school. And we also try to provide a safe space for them to address or to raise questions or concerns that they might have about their upcoming military service, because there's really no space for that. And I want to show you now one slide that I think in a really succinct way captures the essence of why we at New Profile feel there is such a dire need for alternative education in Israel. This is a picture taken from a kindergarten in the center of Israel 4 years ago. I've translated the Hebrew, but I want to walk you through it anyway. It starts with the question, who wants to kill us? And then right to left, a list of people who ostensibly fit this description. Starting from the right-hand side, Pharaoh, the Old Testament, right? Can never go too far back in time to begin this kind of counting. So Pharaoh. Then you have Greeks, Haman, another biblical figure from the book of Esther. Nazis, self-explanatory, I think. And then Arabs. Right? Because all Arabs are the same. The millions of people across the world, we could just categorize Arabs. One word, it sums it all up. Then we have Arabs. What do we need? We need a state. This is a narrative that most Israeli children subscribe to, and unfortunately, on some level, most Israeli adults as well. The overarching narrative in Israel is, we are the Jewish people, we've always been persecuted. The Palestinians are just another group of people in the long line of people who have tried to kill us before, nothing special about them. We have done them, obviously, no wrong. And so the only way that we can deal with this issue is to have a strong military, our own state, and attack them if necessary, which we regularly do. So this is what we're trying to create an alternative to at New Profile. Another thing that we try to do is to raise awareness to the fact that militarism, weapons, violence is so incredibly normalized from infancy in Israel among Jewish Israelis. And how sad is it that this is a normal situation and kids go to weapon exhibits and things like that regularly. And so we try to raise awareness to that this is really not a healthy environment for children. And another thing that we do at New Profile, as part of our campaigns to educate the Israeli public about the excessive militarism of our state, is to address the ways that not only the military has permeated our politics, not only has it permeated our public sector and our civil society, which should be our independent civil society, it has also permeated our economy. And so I want to talk about something that we call the economy of the occupation, and walk you through sort of 5 key elements of it that I think are incredibly important to discuss. The first is economic exploitation of Palestinian labor. On the left-hand side, I brought you a picture of Palestinian men lining up. This is a checkpoint. It's dark outside because it's 2 or 3 or 4 in the morning. And these are Palestinian men lining up to enter into either other areas of the West Bank or into Israel proper to perform labor. What kind of labor? The kind of labor Israeli Jews don't want to do, like construction. Construction is a Palestinian line of work. Jews oversee construction, but we don't perform it ourselves. So, on the right-hand side, I brought you 2 pictures that I think are very important in particular. On the bottom one, this is a Palestinian construction worker building the foundations of the separation barrier. This is the 20-foot concrete wall you see in the background. And this is a Palestinian construction worker building a Jewish settlement. It's a Jewish gated community that only that only Jews can live in, that's built on Palestinian confiscated land. So even the settlement enterprise, even the checkpoints and the wall, these are also all built by actually Palestinian construction workers. And the reason it's important to discuss in this context is we would not have an entire class of basically either underpaid or actual real slave labor at our disposal were it not for the system of the checkpoints, the wall, and the permits. So there's basically 2 types of Palestinians in the West Bank, where, by the way, poverty is severe and unemployment is 70%. They're the kinds that get permits, who have the luxury of waiting around in checkpoints for many, many hours every day in order to cross over to provide for their families. They are so grateful, those who manage to get the checkpoints, get the permits and cross through the checkpoints to actually have any sort of way to provide for their family, that they will not complain, regardless of days without pay or whatever terrible conditions they're made to work under. And they really have no way to complain. But there's the other class of Palestinians, those without permits. They also, many of them, are so desperate to feed their families, they also cross into Israel, sometimes illegally, right, without a permit. They sidestep the wall, they sidestep checkpoints. Physically, it's easy to do. It's just a very highly risky thing to do, because you can be jailed at best or shot dead at worst. And so this class of Palestinians certainly have no grounds from which to demand any human or worker rights, because they have no legal status. So cooking, cleaning, construction, a lot of the manual labor in Israel that's underpaid and undervalued, or not paid at all in the Palestinians' case, is performed by Palestinian men. This is incredibly important to discuss. But not only are they our class of laborers, they're also our class of producers and consumers. Over 70% of what's produced in Palestine is sold exclusively to Israel, because, hey, we control the borders, so we can get to call the shots. We also get to regulate prices. So Israel doesn't allow Palestinians to sell their products, produce and other manufactured goods abroad. Likewise, over 80% of the products imported into Palestine are imported exclusively from Israel, because again, the Israeli government controls all the borders, and we get to regulate what goes in and out. And so, you must have heard that recently the EU passed some resolutions against Israeli produce, particularly fruits and vegetables that are no longer being sold in such quantities in Europe. Not a problem. Israel just forces the Gazans to buy that. So you understand, we have not only Palestinian laborers at our disposal, we also have consumers and producers. It's really quite convenient for the Israeli economy on a larger scale. The second aspect I want to talk about is exploitation of natural resources. There are several natural resources that Israel regularly extracts from the West Bank. Most key, in my opinion, is water. On the left-hand side is Ma'ale Adumim. It's a Jewish settlement. It's a suburb of Jerusalem, 20 minutes away. It's a city of 50,000 people. 5 swimming pools, lush green gardens, as you can see from the photographs. On the right-hand side is Susia, a Palestinian village, 20-minute car ride away. It's in the South Mount Hebron Hills. This is their water situation. The dry season in Israel-Palestine can last up to 5 months. Most Palestinians don't have enough drinking water, let alone for their agricultural needs. So 80% of the water that falls in the West Bank, rainfall, is directed into Jewish settlements or into Israel through pipes that go through Palestinian villages but don't stop there. So most Palestinians not only don't have a terrible water shortage, they're also forced to buy water that falls in the West Bank from Israel at ridiculous prices that Israelis would never stand for. Third aspect of the economy of the occupation, control of population, private security, the wall, and checkpoints. I'm just going to flag this because it's too broad to discuss for more than a few minutes at this point, but constructing the wall, constructing the checkpoints, the machinery involved in the checkpoints, and now even the manpower. It used to be that the IDF was manning the checkpoints. Now that's being outsourced and privatized to private Israeli corporations and international security companies. So all of this enterprise was incredibly profitable for many Israeli contractors and corporations, as well as American, as well as multinational corporations. The fourth aspect is the weapon trade and the weapon industry. Eran talked about it, but I want to say a few more words about it. So the Israeli weapon industry is the 4th largest in the world. And it generates over $7 billion annually in exports alone. That is weapons we produce for others to consume, like the United States. And it provides employment for the country's military elite, as well as for hundreds of thousands of Israeli citizens working on these plants. This is an incredibly central industry to the Israeli economy. And at New Profile, we talk about this in particular because the Israeli military creates a stratified system along gender and class and racial lines that then translates itself very directly into the economy and the labor force later on. Such that if you are an Ashkenazi middle-class male, you'll be drafted to the top units of the military, usually combat, if not any other lucrative unit. From there, it's a pretty direct line to becoming a career soldier. Career soldiers get a really sweet deal in Israel because they get a very handsome salary, tax exempt, their education is paid for, they often get a car and an apartment, and if that's not good enough, they retire at the age of 45. And then, in addition to a very handsome military pension, they get to develop a second career. Now, what kind of career opportunities are open to Ashkenazi middle-class men, former generals in Israel? Any thoughts? Pretty much anything they want is the answer. They can go into politics. If you look at Israeli politics from our inception until today, overwhelmingly our government is made up of Ashkenazi middle-class former generals, men of course. If you look at the public sector, the idea in Israel is that if you are fit to run a unit, you're obviously fit to run, say, a school, a hospital, or any other public institution. So the majority of the public institutions in Israel are also run by former Ashkenazi generals. The private sector is also a good option. High-tech and other kind of lucrative lines of work like that in Israel. There's an old boys network that can certainly get you in quite easily if you were a career soldier. And if none of those options appeal to you, there's always a default, but very profitable default, the weapon industry in Israel, where you get to spread the glories of Israeli knowledge around the world. So a lot of former generals choose to go into the weapon business in Israel. The fifth and last aspect I want to discuss is the security industry. Specialized equipment, military knowledge. This is everything outside of the weapon industry in Israel, but it's also quite central. So some examples to give. One is drones. Israel has now surpassed the United States in drone development and technology. We're actually the global drone leader now. We also use drones regularly around Gaza in particular. Another example I like to give, this is a mock Palestinian village. So it's modeled after a real Palestinian village. It's real size. It's built in the Negev in the south of Israel. And this is where the IDF, there are 6 of these, and where the IDF trains itself in counterinsurgency urban warfare. But not only the IDF, also American troops, before they're deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan, have regularly stopped over at these kinds of mock Palestinian villages to train with the IDF in counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, whatever your government is calling it these days. And another example I like to give is a special computer device attached to a camera that the IDF developed, initially used in checkpoints on the wall around Gaza and the West Bank. This computer device gives an analysis, like a computerized analysis of a person's body motions, and gives an analysis, is this person a potential threat or terrorist? As I said, initially used in Palestinians, later sold abroad, so now many airports across this country, in the United States that is, carry this device. You may not see it, but it's there. So these are just some examples. It's the tip of the iceberg, but just to give you a sense of the breadth of the Israeli security industry. And this is not a conspiracy theory. If you look at all the websites of the security industry in Israel, this is a marketing strategy. They say very bluntly, we tried it on Palestinians, it works, buy our products. So it's totally open information for the public, you can go check it out yourself. Our current economy minister of Israel, Naftali Bennett, said recently in January 20th, a month ago, a Palestinian state will destroy the Israeli economy. There you have it. Our own economy minister, in his own words, confirmed what I think we all know hopefully now after this presentation, which is that our economy is far too dependent upon the occupation of the Palestinian people and their lands for us to want to let it go. We have zero economic incentive to end it. I want to end by talking very briefly about the group that Eran and I are here representing today, which is Anarchists Against the Wall. This is the only Israeli Palestinian collective that does work on the ground in Palestine in a democratic way. We're not an NGO, we're a popular movement. And we have joined Palestinian popular committees across the West Bank and East Jerusalem, primarily in protests that they invite us to, which they often do. So this is us in Bil'in, the village Eran mentioned. This is us marching up to the wall, and the tear gas that was tried on us, we now know. Now it's a wall, it used to be a fence. But one of the things that we've done since our inception in 2003 is to join regularly, on a weekly and sometimes daily basis, Palestinians in their popular struggle and protest against the wall. Unfortunately, there are very few Israelis who actually do that, go in and protest with our Palestinian comrades. The second thing that we do is direct actions. So on the top, this is members of our group taking down parts of the separation fence, and this is us removing roadblocks. Another military strategy of Israel is to regularly move space. So gates open and shut without notice. Roads get blocked and then removed. And this is, again, to render Palestinians uncertain and to make sure that we have the ultimate command of space. And so we come in and we try as best we can when we have the chance to remove roadblocks, to physically just come and remove them, or pieces of the fence when it is a fence, so that we can make the Palestinian life just a little bit easier. And the last thing we do is educational displays within Israel. Unfortunately, these days, you can be an Israeli, you can be sitting your cappuccino in Tel Aviv or in Jerusalem, and the occupation is out of sight, out of mind. So we try to remind Israelis that 20 minutes away from them, life looks very, very different. By doing things like this. This is a mock road closure we put in the middle of Tel Aviv, just to remind Israelis what it might look like and feel like to live under occupation. But we're really here, Eran and I are on this tour, we're here because we've been asked to help fundraise for Palestinian political prisoners. Over 40% of Palestinian men have been through the prison system since '67. As of this November, there are almost 5,000 of them in Israeli prisons and Israeli detention facilities. Almost 5,000 Palestinian political prisoners. 159 of them are children, that means under the age of 18, over 30 under the age of 16. 145 of them are under administrative detention. Administrative detention is a really clever military law that enables us to capture and detain a Palestinian up to 6 months without trial, and sometimes without being told what they're accused of because it's classified information. There's a catch, it gets better. This 6-month period can be renewed indefinitely from the command of a pretty low-ranking officer in the IDF. So we have comrades of ours, Palestinians, who are in prison for years and have not yet seen a judge. It's important to explain, though, in this context, that the military court system is set up in such a way that when a Palestinian is being tried, the judge is a military officer with a law degree, the prosecutor is a military officer with a law degree, and the defense attorney is a military officer with a law degree. So you have 3 IDF soldiers with law degrees trying Palestinians. So it shouldn't surprise you that 99.9% is the conviction rate in the court system of the military. And so what we've done to address this problem is we've set up a legal fund, the Anarchists Against the Wall, in coalition with all of the popular committees of the Palestinian villages we work with regularly. And the fund funds a team of Israeli and Palestinian lawyers that work day in and day out to help and give aid to Palestinian political prisoners, sometimes to Israeli internationals. So if any of you are more radical, you want to come to Palestine, you might find yourself in a protest, you might find yourself arrested, you better donate today, because our team of lawyers is the only team that's going to get you out, and Israeli prisons aren't fun. Spoken from experience. No, but seriously, the main people that need this so desperately are Palestinian political prisoners that are really rotting away in Israeli prisons right now, every day. And so when it's not a lawyer from our fund that's representing them, they get a military officer with a law degree. It's really quite crucial that we get the money to help support them with our team of lawyers. So what we're going to do is we're going to pass around a jar. And I know that everyone comes from different backgrounds and has different situations, but if you can give anything, even $1, it is very, very important. And it's not an NGO, there's no salary. It's all going directly to the lawyers and to give bail money for the Palestinians. The military regularly sets high bail.